So you already know about this study. Thanks to my good friend Ivis, you have seen the paper. One of my co-authors is here, Carlos. I don't know if Christina and Jessica would get a chance to present, but I am presenting on behalf of the team. The first author was our wonderful Jessica, who is very close to finishing her PhD, becoming Dr. Talbot. And continuing the great work that she has been doing in the past few years on post-disaster recovery. What I will focus today, so this work has had multiple pieces, with a very big piece being social vulnerability of the residents of Puerto Rico. I'm not going to spend as much time on that because I want to spend most of my time today on the informality piece and the connection between informal decisions for disaster reconstruction, focus on housing, and social capital. So I wanted to put this out there just to be totally clear. Are the slides moving or not? Are they moving? Okay.
Yeah.
Very briefly, I don't need to give too much background on what happened in Puerto Rico in 2017 with Hurricane Maria. Everybody here, I can assume, knows way more than I do about the multiple facets of impacts of Hurricane Maria, devastation of Hurricane Maria on the island of Puerto Rico. Very, very briefly, the angle that we picked to come into this study when we had the very first conversations in 2017 with Christina and Jessica was to look at the informality. And the reason we got interested in this is that we started reading story after story that many people were getting denied for any kind of assistance from government agencies as they were trying to start kickstarting repairs of their homes. So we started seeing all of these ineffectiveness and inefficiencies around starting off of the repairs in a context for an island that already had suffered decades of neglect in terms of infrastructure support, structural integrity support for not only residential structures, but all kinds of buildings. And starting to look into it, we realized that, okay, we are talking about the context of more than half, if not more, of the residential structures before the storm, before Hurricane Maria, having been built partially or fully through informal processes. I'll define for you how we define and measured informality in just a few seconds. Informality included not having a permit for changing or adding anything to the house or building the house from scratch. Not having any engineer or professional construction person looking at the quality of your building. Different components of this was considered. So we realized in this context, we can ask a few research questions that link to social capital, but also more importantly, link to informality. So what does social capital do here? I'll come back to the informality in just a minute. What does social capital do for us here? Why social capital was part of the research questions, research interest that we had. So from the beginning, what we figured was that these people have to rebuild somehow. They need to mobilize resources and rebuild their houses as shelter, temporary or permanent somehow. So in the absence of any external resources, context of poverty, low income, it means low savings, low credit scores with banks and financial institutions. What do they draw upon? We realized from previous literature, also from anecdotes coming out of Puerto Rico, that one of the resources that they could rely on potentially would be social capital, which we define looking at the literature in previous literature as simply as the ties that the individuals create themselves to bring benefits to themselves and others. That's the most important part. So social capital for us translates into labor, hours of work, dollars, money, material for reconstruction, advice for reconstruction, you name it. It translates into resources. So features of social organizations, such as networks, norms, and social trusts, would go under this umbrella of social capital that facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit. That mutual benefit here is really keyword, and you see we are going all the way back to the classics. When we define social capital, we're going all the way back to Professor Putnam, his 1995 publication, which is really a cornerstone here. To operationalize this, to translate this into a research question that links informal reconstruction in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and these resources that would come from social capital, we decided to adapt this conceptualization that is newer, newish, that breaks it down to bonding social capital, bridging social capital, linking social capital, or replace the word social capital, if you will, by relationships, okay? Now, what does that look like in our context? Just to give you a very, very simple visual to think about that. It looks like this. We have within communities, and here think about smaller units, community somewhat of an equivalent of a neighborhood or a small town. Within communities, the relationships that people have with folks similar to themselves would be defining the bonding, cohesion, social cohesion. The connections and relationships across these homogeneous groups, which would make them different heterogeneous groups, would be the bridging social capital. Let's say folks who come to my Baptist church, local Baptist church, would be having bonding social capital together, but they would have social relationship, social network, strong ties with this group of people who go to my local Methodist church. As simple as that. That would be the bridging social capital. And then linking would go upwards in terms of power. Any kind of relationships, personal or not personal, more like general relationships with any official institution. In our case, because we are looking at disaster recovery, official response institutions would define linking social capital. Relationships with aid organizations, relationships with federal organizations, relationships with FEMA folks who come after a disaster to help. So that's how we conceptualize that. Now, moving forward, the question that we wanted to ask had to kind of create an overlap between these two theoretical concepts, social capital and informality, and the case at hand that we were looking at, the issues at hand that we were looking at. So we wanted to address this research gap of identifying which forms of social capital are most instrumental in post-disaster reconstruction, but not any form of not every form of post-disaster reconstruction, a very particular form of post-disaster reconstruction, which is informal post-disaster reconstruction. So the questions we ask: what role does social capital play in informal housing reconstruction? Our case is Puerto Rico, of course. And what forms of social capital are most salient in supporting informal housing reconstruction? These are the two questions that we wanted to ask. Now, how did we go about answering these questions? That's where our big research team comes into play, and we do have a representative here. So the two cases we selected, I'll tell you in a bit kind of the rationale behind selecting these two communities. They do represent similarities and differences in terms of location, access to resources, density, but very importantly, a little bit of variation in terms of informal context. So overall, to give you a little bit of background on what we did in our study was that just over a year all of those meetings in my office, Christina's office, putting ideas on the whiteboard, not loving them, starting from scratch, which is the beginning of any research project, got us to a point of getting IRB approval almost a year after the hurricane, and starting our surveys in two little municipalities. Um, um, Local Puerto Ricans, Spanish speakers, please forgive me for destroying and not pronouncing these names in the way that I should pronounce them. I can promise you that I have practiced, but as somebody who doesn't speak Spanish, I know I'm going to salvage the whole words. We picked Loiza in the northeastern region of the island. You can see a small red pointer on my map. And we also picked Yabucoa in the southeastern part of region of the island. These two areas were chosen for the significant damages to the housing stock that they suffered from Hurricane Maria. And they were also significantly very low income areas. So we hypothesized that they would both need to rely on informal practices for repairing, reconstructing their homes, especially in the absence of significant federal or state, in this case, territory, external recovery resources. To give you a little bit of background description of these two communities, I'm going to give you a little bit of details if you bear with me. These details are somewhat actually are very important to make in for us to make sense of the data collection and the results of our data collection. So what kind of places are these that were hit by Hurricane Maria, and then we did our data collection? If you look at Loiza, the community in the northeast region of the island, it is pretty close to the capital city and the main metropolitan area of San Juan. So its location has the potential to improve residents' access to emergency resources in the recovery phase. However, its close proximity to San Juan also made them witness the ineffectiveness and inefficiencies and sometimes inequalities in distribution of resources from the capital city to everywhere else in the island. I think the island character of this of the disaster area also plays a very, very important role here. So in the conversations that our team had during the data collection and even before Jessica started the data collection, we picked up some perceptions, especially in Loiza, about reduced trust amongst residents in the recovery efforts, and also impaired relationships with resource distributors on the island. Many of you might be familiar already with some of those narratives. In terms of topography, Loiza is mostly a flat in a flat area, and it has mostly coastal in terms of geography. It is non-urban. The population density and configuration is more rural, but is more densely populated than other rural areas on the island, maybe because of its proximity to San Juan. Although this area, Loiza, was not in the direct path of Hurricane Maria, the housing stock in this municipality was significantly affected and required major reconstruction. And there were estimates of 6,000 plus cases of significant roof damages or significant foundation damages. To give you a little bit of context of what kind of community Loiza was, the local average income, this might come as a big surprise maybe to our friends here on US mainland, but I'm sure it's not to our Puerto Rico friends. The average annual income of just over 17,000 a year, which was even lower than the Puerto Rico average annual income. And this comes from census. I realized the inconsistencies with the census data on Puerto Rico, even lower than the $19,000 of Puerto Rico, which, to put it in context, significantly lower than the 57K average annual income of the US mainland. So compare 17K per year average annual household with 57K per year for US mainland. More than half of the 26,000 residents of Loiza live below poverty line, according to United States Census Bureau, before the hurricane. And unemployment rate was about 8%, which is close to Puerto Rico's unemployment rate. Now, please come all the way down to the southeast case study we had, Yabucoa. In the southeastern corner of the island, it was the first area on the path of Hurricane Maria. It is comparatively, relatively more isolated than Loiza because of its distance from other major population centers. Which does increase the risk of isolation, especially risk of isolation from disaster recovery resources, the recovery resources that were coming to Puerto Rico. The topography of Yabucoa includes both coastal, more flatlands, and mountainous regions. The density of population, as you might expect, would reduce going from in Yabucoa, going from mountainous regions to going from coastal regions to the more mountainous parts of this region. And isolation really, even though we had quite a few communities, the population density in the mountainous regions was lower, and isolation was really a serious issue here in terms of access to resources and access to institutional support. And just finding NGOs who would be distributing support in your area. Damages were more significant here, as you would expect, being on the path of the hurricane. More than 9,500 houses in Yabucoa experienced damage and or roof in their roof or foundation. The population is somewhat larger than Loiza. We have more than 33,000 people. Average annual income is even lower than Loiza at $15,000 a year, which again, compare it to the 57,000 per year for the mainland, with unemployment rate of significantly high unemployment rate of more than 12%. So I'm hoping that this would give you all a picture of the context, pre-Maria context, within which the damages happened to the homes of these people. But what kinds of people, what kinds of housing, what kinds of local economy is being affected here? And put that in the context of not just the damages, but also, use this as a context for not just the damages, but also for the gross lack of attention and resources for recovery afterwards. Okay, so moving on, how did our data collection go? Starting December 2018, like I said, 1 year after Hurricane Maria, all the way up to January of 2018. So this means our wonderful Jessica used her winter break time to go there with Carlos, and we were able to recruit 7 local research assistants from University of Puerto Rico for this data collection. And they collected in-person surveys. I will give you a little more details in a second. Total with 305 households within these 2 municipalities. Initially, in Iowa State, we developed the surveys in English. Some of us don't have the privilege of speaking Spanish, unfortunately, but we had them translated, and not just translated to Spanish, but also reviewed by a few of our Spanish-speaking colleagues to make sure that not just the language, but also culturally, the language we are using in the surveys are appropriate, make sense, are totally understandable. Almost all of the surveys were conducted by this team orally. There was, Carlos, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was very, very rare for y'all to leave the survey, paper survey, with anybody. For the most part, you would conduct it reading through the questions, entering the answers yourself. The sampling procedure, oh, I should be, my bad. I should be clicking for this to show up actually. All right. The sampling procedure was a little bit different than what I usually use, especially if you're doing survey work in US mainland, where we have really much better data in terms of population distribution and socio-demographic features of the population. Unfortunately, we didn't have very good sampling background demographic information on the residents here. So we came up with somewhat of a middle ground solution for sampling with a quota sampling method. So within the quotas that we had, like quotas that would say we need to have X% of informal versus non-informal reconstruction, X% of people that belong to different neighborhoods to have somewhat of a representative distribution. Within that, we had to use also convenience sampling to actually choose and recruit participants depending on who was home, who was willing and able to participate and respond to our questions, so on and so forth. So depending on the size and the administrative boundaries within each of the two areas, you have a map of Loiza up there on my slide. And these two areas were broken down into the 12 or 6 neighborhoods that they had, which I think locally they were called barrios. We approached and prioritized neighborhoods according to the proportion of the total population of the municipality that lived in that neighborhood. Of course, we wanted to keep the quota as much as possible accurate to represent them in a good way. It was, like I said, a little bit difficult to get identify the breakdown of demographics within each of these neighborhoods, because there wasn't much accurate up-to-date record of the population demographics. So the only variable that we could consistently consider for creating the quota categories were the size of the population. Ideally, of course, we would have wanted to consider in our quota sampling the age distributions, the employment versus unemployment status, those kinds of things. But we didn't have good background information for that to use in our sampling. The communication capabilities were another challenge, which I'm not going to get into too details on, but we decided to do everything door to door, do everything in person to ensure and increase the reliability and quality of the data that we were collecting in this context, which is also another big difference from other survey work that I have done before, that very easily you would send a link to your participants with a postcard, or you would mail the survey, or you would purchase phone numbers and do phone surveys. We decided to not go any of those routes because of the particular Puerto Rico situation, and go door to door on our own to do this data collection. There were a few filtering questions to make sure that we get the correct participants. I'm not going to go through those, but I do want to highlight something that is really important to this particular data collection in Puerto Rico because of informality and context of informality, not just informality post-disaster, informality of construction before. And that has to do with the blurry line between temporary reconstruction and permanent reconstruction, which we measured in this case study different from the way we would measure it in many other, I don't want to say any other, but I will say in many other post-disaster recovery case studies that we would do. The distinction was difficult to make, was difficult to establish between temporary and permanent structures in the post Maria Puerto Rico recovery, because even before the hurricane, many temporary structures have been used as long-term solutions. This is really important to remember in the context of the high poverty, high unemployment rate, very, very low average income that I just mentioned when I was giving you the background of these communities. So many temporary structures have been used as long-term solutions here, often with small improvements here and there gradually made as the homeowner gets access to this $200 here, $300 there, getting my cousin to come do this, do that, help me with changing that window frame, whatever it is, just gradual changes here. Therefore, homes that have been repaired temporarily, examples such as patching or salvaging their damaged roof pieces, or pieces of the window. We also decided to consider them after much discussion in our analysis, because many of these households explained that they were using these fixes not as what we see on face value as temporary repair, but for them as permanent repair. It's interesting, if I may add here, from a different case study that I did 2 years ago after Maria. I mean, we often assume that these kinds of practices are common in places like Puerto Rico, which is not the case. I had this post-tornado study in Marshalltown, Iowa, after a tornado in 2018. And I was very surprised, but I shouldn't have been if I had known better, at how much those temporary practices also happen in the very, very low income neighborhoods, just to give people a roof to stay in during the very, very cold winters of Iowa. If anybody has ever visited or stayed in Iowa, you know what I'm talking about. So I was seeing, to my surprise, these temporary, informal, piecemeal practices similar to what I had seen in Puerto Rico in the mainland US too, which as a housing recovery researcher was very eye-opening. So in addition to that, temporary housing is also a common housing method for people on the island, again, regardless of Hurricane Maria, particularly in the low-income, socioeconomically vulnerable communities. Now, let me give you a little bit of information about the survey, what kinds of questions we asked, because I would assume that would be the most interesting thing for you about our data collection here. Of course, we ask for demographic data, especially to capture socio-demographic vulnerability, but also as control variables, because disaster literature has shown time after time that these social vulnerabilities do determine impacts. The second important part of our survey had to do with questions that helped us identify the level of completed reconstruction, regardless of how you did it, level of the completed reconstruction, and then how much of the reconstruction on their home was done informally. We had some specifications for informal reconstruction. We define informal reconstruction as any construction performed on the house without engineers or architects involved, without following building codes or applying or getting a permit, or without a proof of ownership on the house. You're just living there. You don't have any proof to show that this is your home, and you are doing this piecemeal, gradual repairs on the house. The other things that we asked, of course, very importantly, had to do with social capital, measuring bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. Briefly, bonding social capital was measured based on two items: the frequency of households working with others in their community to achieve some mutual benefit, and the frequency of them attending community events, somebody's kid's graduation party, somebody's funeral, birthdays, so on and so forth. Bridging was measured based on 4 items: the frequency with which the respondents interacted with people who live in different communities, by this I mean neighborhoods, and the frequency with which these respondents would interact with people who are from a different socioeconomic status, who are from different religions, who are from different ethnicity groups, which is not very common. Not all of them are common in Puerto Rico or in the regions that we were doing data collection. Finally, the linking social capital was measured based on 9 different items. I'm not going to list them all here for you, but they have to do with personal connections and relationships, interactions with federal government employees, FEMA representatives, local government employees, NGOs, and so on and so forth. And we use different scales to measure this. We measured consistency using Chromebox Alpha, so on and so forth. And like I said, 305 total responses from households, 163 from in Loiza and 174 from Yoboka. Okay, so what we all have been waiting for. What did we find? Going from our descriptive analysis, which of course any good researcher, empirical researcher has to start with, to our regression analysis, here are the variables that we looked at. We looked at the relationship between these independent factors that we were interested in, bonding, bridging, linking factors, on dependent variables, which was percentage of informal reconstruction, percentage of completed reconstruction, regardless of how they did it. So what did we see in the patterns of reconstruction? Number one, use of informal reconstruction. You can see that overall, let me turn this on. Overall, about 83% of respondents used at least some level of informal reconstruction. And more than a third of our respondents reported using only informal. So everything I did was informal. No use of architects, no use of engineers, no permits, no building codes. Think about the safety consequences of that. These percentages suggest that the vast majority of the survey residents use some elements of informality in their reconstruction, and majority of homeowners use informal reconstruction for specific portions here and there of the work they did. You see the spectrum going from 0 informal to 100% informal, and the dividing line here is in the middle, 50%, 53% less, 47% more than half of their work being done informally. And they look at the outcomes regardless of level of informality. What you see is that in terms of completed reconstruction, only 12%, 15 months after Hurricane Maria, only 12% had fully completed reconstruction of their home, and 64% had completed only half or less, 50% or less, which in most cases, given the level of destruction, 50% or less overall repairs to a home would not make it habitable unless you have no other choice. You just have to, you're stuck with the half or less repaired home. The vast majority, as you can see, 88% of our respondents still required a significant amount of work to complete the reconstruction of their houses 15 months after Hurricane Maria, which shows a very, very great anomaly and difference from the numbers that we see in our mainland case studies. On social capital impact with our regression, what did we find? Not surprisingly for bonding, because we are talking about bonding social capital in low-income context, high poverty context. Bonding social capital did not show a statistically significant effect on the outcomes of the construction. The same thing applied to the linking social capital in significant positive effects on outcomes. If you think about it, both of those things make sense. With bonding, there's not much resources within your social cohesion network to draw upon. So what are you going to draw upon on that social capital network to help your reconstruction? With linking, we knew that there was there was very small amount and at very, very slow pace for the external resources to come. We all read and heard about the stories with different federal organizations and how the assistance was delayed. But interestingly, when it comes to bridging, that relationship, connections to other communities, not your own closest connections, we saw mixed effects, but both significant. We saw significant effects in terms of bridging social capital, increasing the level of informal reconstruction, but very interestingly, bridging social capital decreased significantly the level of completed reconstruction, regardless of how you accomplish this reconstruction. What are some of the implications, some of the important implications that we came up with for the research literature, for our academic researcher friends? The most important ones have to do with the fact that we need to include and realize that informal reconstruction exists in many, many places, not just in Puerto Rico. In certain places like Puerto Rico, with the context of history of institutional gaps, is much more widespread. So we need to have a way to measure it and include it in our studies. Informal reconstruction before disasters can really help us predict who is going to be able to recover and who is not, because of the way our assistance programs are designed. And informal reconstruction context before disaster can help inform how resources are mobilized and distributed in post-disaster recovery. But these are not the most interesting implications, I would argue. The most interesting implications are for policy and practice. What do we need to change to actually help people, to help more people in a more equitable way? Number one, our research specifically on that effect, significant effect of bridging social capital, shows the importance of prioritizing by civil organizations, by NGOs, prioritizing and supporting bridging networks for social capital, because we know those bridging networks are going to translate into resources. At least this research shows that. For policy implications, we can see how and where to distribute resources. The fact that we need to change assistance eligibility criteria if we know in a certain place the percentage of informal reconstruction not having deeds or proofs of ownership are not consistent. So you don't have to ask for all of those eligibility documents and requirements if you know this is the context you're coming into, if you want to actually help people recover their homes. It also shows, our findings shows support for distribution of assistance through trusted local community groups because of the importance of the bridging social capital. It shows the importance of enhancing the local government institutional capacities for supporting formal reconstruction. We can't just say, oh, just because this percentage or just because your house is informally owned or built, you are excluded from all of my post-disaster recovery assistance. Instead of doing that, we can be proactive before disaster, provide institutional support, do the institutional restructuring that is needed to make sure things do become formal, do become up to code, get inspections, so on and so forth, before the disaster. After disaster is not the time to punish people for not having the formal paperwork. And finally, we can clearly see the importance of targeting informal structures for pre-disaster mitigation. Because without that, you have a long and very difficult and painful road towards recovery, which road to recovery is long and hard for all kinds of housing. This research shows how much more complicated and more painful it can be when you put it on the informal context. So let's reduce the damages before the hurricane comes. That is